Hello, dear friends. Today we begin our exploration of the memoirs of German non-commissioned officer Helmut Pabst. At dawn on June 22, 1941, Germany crossed the border with the Soviet Union and Romania with the full might of its 3 million-strong army. One army group launched an attack in a northeasterly direction along the Vilnius-Leningrad line. Another strike was launched to the southeast, toward Kyiv. The third was carried out by Army Group Center under the command of von Bock, advancing eastward along the Bialystok, Minsk, Smolensk, Moscow axis. A 30-year-old communications non-commissioned officer, Helmut Pabst, a former law student and participant in the German occupation of France, was attached to the artillery unit of this army group. From the first week of the Russian campaign, he kept a diary in the form of letters to his parents and friends in Frankfurt am Main. He wrote particularly often to his father, who had fought against Russia in World War I. The offensive on Smolensk. It is hard to believe that this happened just 2 days ago. This time I was in the first attacking echelon. The units moved silently into their positions, speaking in whispers. The wheels of the assault guns creaked. 2 nights earlier, we had reconnoitered the area. Now we were waiting for the infantry. The infantrymen approached in dark, ghostly columns and moved forward through fields of cabbage and grain. We marched alongside them to serve as the 2nd Battalion's artillery liaison unit. In a potato field, the order, "Dig in," was given. Battery number 10 was to open fire early in the morning. May 3rd. The first volley. At that very moment, everything around us came to life. Fire along the entire front, infantry guns, mortars. The Russian watchtowers vanished in flashes of fire. Shells rained down on the enemy batteries, whose positions had been pinpointed long before the attack. In a column and in spread formation, the infantry surged forward. Swamps, ditches, boots full of water and mud. Over our heads, barrage fire rained down from position to position. Flamethrowers advanced against the strong points. Machine gun fire and the piercing whistle of bullets. My young radio operator, carrying 40 pounds of gear on his back, felt somewhat weakened during the first half hour. Then, near the barracks in Konopki, we encountered our first serious resistance. The front lines were bogged down. "Assault guns, forward!" We were with the battalion commander on a small hill, 500 meters from the barracks. One of the messengers became our first casualty. We had barely established radio contact when suddenly we came under fire from the nearby barracks. A sniper. We picked up our rifles for the first time. Even though we were signalmen, we must have been better shots. The sniper's fire stopped. Our first kill. The offensive continued. We advanced quickly, sometimes hugging the ground, but relentlessly. Trenches, water, sand, sun. We were constantly changing positions. Thirst. No time to eat. By 10 o'clock, we had already become seasoned soldiers who had seen quite a lot. Abandoned positions, overturned armored vehicles, the first prisoners, the first dead Russians. We sat in the trench for 3 hours that night. Tanks threatened us from the flanks, and once again, our advance was preceded by barrage fire. On both sides of us, attacking battalions. Bright flashes erupted very close by. We found ourselves right in the line of fire. The first burned-out village, of which only chimneys remained. Here and there, sheds and ordinary wells. For the first time, we came under artillery fire. The shells made an unusual whistling sound. We had to quickly dig in and burrow into the ground. We were constantly changing positions. We laid our equipment on the ground. Reception, unlike yesterday's, was good. But we had barely managed to receive the report when the battalion moved on. We rushed to catch up with it. Around 3 o'clock, we crossed the line of trenches, marching through the marshes. Suddenly, a halt. Someone gave the order, "Anti-tank guns, forward!" The guns roared past. Then, ahead of us, lay a sandy expanse covered with thickets of broom. It stretched for about 2 kilometers to the main road and the river near the Osovets fortress. For breakfast, we had a piece of bread. For lunch, 1 hardtack for the 4 of us. Thirst, heat, and that damned sand. We trudged wearily along, taking turns carrying the load. Water sloshed in our boots, filled with mud and sand. Our faces were covered in 2 days' worth of stubble. Finally, the battalion headquarters at the edge of the plain. Up by the river, our outpost. The Russians know exactly where we are. We quickly dig in. God knows, not too quickly. We already know exactly when a shell is approaching, and I can't help but laugh as we bury our heads in our foxholes, pressing ourselves to the ground like Muslims during namaz. But finally, a little bit of good news. The infantry pulls back. We pack up our equipment and make a dash during a lull in the artillery fire. Others are running to our right and left, and we all plop down in the mud at the same time. I can't help but laugh. Once we reached a relatively safe spot, we gathered in the trench and waited for darkness. We shared our last cigarettes. The mosquitoes went completely wild. More signals started coming in. I nearly went mad trying to decode them because my flashlight attracted even more mosquitoes. And again, infantry appeared, returning from the front line. We didn't quite understand what was happening. We knew there had to be a hill somewhere, a deep trench. There, soup and coffee awaited us, as much as we wanted. After walking another 2 kilometers in the twilight, we ended our raid at one of our batteries. Soon we were lying next to each other, pulling our jackets up over our ears. Russian shells wished us good night. When we emerged again around 4 o'clock, we found ourselves 100 meters from our headquarters. An hour later we were marching west, then north. When night fell, we were near the village of Augustov, whose church, with its 2 domes, reminded me of my father. A short distance from Augustov, heading toward Grodno, we were again put on combat alert. We were to be ready by 10:30. We were roused at 1:30, and finally set out at 5 in the morning. The situation was constantly changing. The front was approaching very rapidly. We marched toward Grodno, where we were to be thrown into battle. Marshes stretched out to the right and left. An entire Russian tank brigade, presumably somewhere to the right, though you never see such things. You only see mosquitoes. There are plenty of them, and feel the dust. Finally, in the evening, we entered a village via country roads and marched through Lipsk along the same roads. Everywhere, clouds of dust rose into the air and swirled slowly behind the columns along the roads. The road to Kuznitsa is completely covered in sand, broken up, crisscrossed with ruts, and full of shell craters. It slopes downward like the bottom of a dried-up sea. With great difficulty, we cross the slopes at a forced march. At times, the path winds like a snake. It must be like the Napoleonic campaigns. At night, we stop somewhere amid the sands. It is cool, and it is raining. Shivering, we crawl under the trucks. In the morning, we continue on our way, dirty and dusty, with beads of sweat trickling down our faces. Kuznitsa. On either side of the narrow road we're walking along are 3 cemeteries: Catholic, Orthodox, and Jewish. The first Orthodox church on our route, with its onion-domed roofs. Meanwhile, the monotonous plain has given way to a charming, park-like landscape. Gardens spread out around the houses, a modest claim to beauty, simple decorations on the houses, and fruit trees. This little town has been partially destroyed. An entire neighborhood has burned down. In one of the houses, the kitchen and a piece of pipe have survived. A man and a woman are crawling around it, and smoke is rising from that corner. An old man in a sheepskin coat, barefoot, sits on a chair, smiling happily at us. His red nose, typical of a drinker, stands out against the backdrop of his thin, unkempt beard. An hour later, we came out onto a decent, solid road, heading toward north. Light artillery was moving with us. The horses and guns approaching the crest of the hill we had just crossed looked like paper cutouts. It's not hot. A slightly hilly plain and no dust. A wonderful morning. The thatched wooden houses may have been dilapidated, but the village church stood white and gleaming on the hill, a visible symbol of its authority. This march is more exhausting than battle. An hour and a half rest, from 1:30 to 3. Later, as we marched on, the moon was behind us, and we were heading toward a dark, threatening sky. It was like stepping into a dark hole. The ghostly landscape was pale and bare. We slept for an hour like the dead, and got up on unsteady legs with a terrible heaviness in our stomachs. A gentle morning, pale, beautiful colors. You wake up slowly, and at every halt you sleep. At any time while moving forward, you can see soldiers sleeping by the roadside, where they have dropped to the ground. Sometimes they curl up like the dead, or, like a pair of motorcyclists I saw this morning, content to be on their own, back to back, resting in their long overcoats and steel helmets, legs spread apart and hands in their pockets. The thought that it was time to get up barely penetrated the haze of sleep. It took me a long time to wake up. When I woke my neighbor, he kept lying there leaning back with a completely lifeless face. I approached another man who was on sentry duty. He had deep wrinkles on his face and feverishly gleaming eyes. Another had started writing a letter to his girlfriend and had fallen asleep in the process. I carefully pulled out the sheet of paper. He hadn't managed to write even 3 lines. July 13th, 1941. We set off at 4:30 p.m., just before a thunderstorm. We were sweating terribly. The storm rolled in like a rumbling veil. It was a relief, but the stifling heat didn't go away. For 4 hours we marched at an incredible pace without stopping. Even after that, we were tricked every time we stopped to rest. We moved on almost immediately. As night fell, they let us rest for only 3/4 of an hour. Night. From the hill where we stood, we could see lights scattered far on the horizon. At first I thought it was dawn. Yellow dust hung around us like fog, lazily drifting apart or enveloping the roadside bushes. When the sun rose on the horizon as a red orb, we ran into a problem with our draft animals. In the dim light, the wagon of our airborne radio observation post, a giant on enormous wheels that had once served as a French field forage depot, slipped off the log-planked road. One horse got tangled in the harness, and the other 2, which had been led along the plank road ahead to clear the way, got bogged down in the mud and tangled in the field communication wires. What a mess. With the help of fresh horses and another pair brought in to assist, we freed the stuck wagon and hurried after our unit. We found them sooner than we expected, a few kilometers ahead, in the woods by a lake. The entire forest was filled with troops and stacks of ammunition, occupying every last square meter of open space. We heated up our lunch and pitched a tent, and just as we crawled inside, it started to rain. Raindrops seeped through a small hole in the canvas roof, falling on my face, but the weather was still muggy, so I actually liked it. Besides, I was very tired. In the morning, I went down to the lake. The water was warm. I had time to wash my underwear, which had already taken on a grayish, earthy color. July 16th. We resumed our march at 2 p.m. We marched until our knees were shaking all the way to Point L. It was already very close, and we were terribly thirsty. In the village, one of our horses lost a horseshoe. A thunderstorm broke out, and I, along with the others, stayed behind to find a blacksmith in one of the batteries following behind us. Our own blacksmith had stayed far behind to repair the field kitchen, whose rear axle had broken. We found the blacksmith. Some of the guys gave us bread, tea, cigarettes, and cigarette paper, and we rode off into the gathering twilight and another thunderstorm. The horses kept darting from side to side, unable to make out the path. Finally, an hour later, we came upon the heavy silhouettes of the artillery pieces at the roadside, which had fallen behind the unit. In the rain, dark figures huddled against the vehicles or lay beneath them in strange-looking heaps. I found all my companions lying under the trees. They were fast asleep, and the horses had rested their heads on each other's necks. Between 5 and 6 in the morning, we reached the designated rest area in a meadow, just above one of the villages. We got up at noon and set off at 4. A 4-hour march in wet boots. By evening, it had grown cool. The road rose and fell through a monotonous landscape, and the sound of gunfire could be heard in the distance. Bomb craters were visible by the road. By 2:20 a.m., we turned onto a grassy patch. It was cold and damp, with a biting headwind. We gathered some wet hay and set up a tent. Someone had a candle. Now that we were inside, it suddenly felt quite cozy. 4 people, comfortably settled in the shelter around a friendly, warm light. Someone said, "We won't forget this evening," and everyone agreed. July 20th, 1941. Today marks exactly 4 weeks. Since we crossed the German border, we have covered 800 kilometers. After Kulm, 1,250. On the 18th night, the exact distance from the crossroads in Stankina, where we were gathered to set off toward Grev and Osovets, was 750 kilometers. I am sitting on a bench by the ferryman's hut. We were waiting for the rest of our unit to begin the difficult crossing of the western Dvina, which our small group took an hour to cross on horseback. Designed for a load of 8 tons, the makeshift one-way bridge could not handle the entire flow of people crossing. At the foot of the steep bank, crowds of prisoners of war are helping to build a second bridge. Barefoot civilians toil wearily among the debris of the old bridge, which has blocked the small river. The crossing may take many hours. The hands of 150 prisoners, ready to push, are at our disposal. The city of Vitebsk lies in ruins. Traffic lights hang from the tram wires like bats. A face on a movie poster still smiles from the fence. The population, mostly women, busily wanders among the ruins in search of charred planks for a fire or discarded utensils. Some streets on the outskirts remain intact, and every now and then, as if by magic, a small, surviving shack appears. Some girls are dressed quite nicely, though sometimes they wear undershirts, carry string bags, and walk barefoot with a bundle on their backs. There were peasants from the countryside. They wore sheepskin coats or cotton-padded jackets, and the women had headscarves. Workers lived on the outskirts, idle young men and women with insolent expressions. Sometimes you'd be struck by the sight of a person with a handsome face, and only then notice how poorly they were dressed. The order to continue our march was canceled at the last moment. We stopped and loosened the harness. Then, just as we were about to give the horses a quarter of their usual ration of oats, a new order arrived. We were to set out immediately, moving at a forced march. The crossing had been cleared for us. We turned back, first heading south in the general direction of Smolensk. The march turned out to be peaceful, though in the heat and dust, but only for 18 kilometers. Yet after the easy day before, the tension and fatigue made me forget the beauty of the landscape. We were attached to an infantry division that was advancing even further east, and indeed, we marched day and night and continue to march. Before us lay fields of gently swaying corn, hectares of fragrant clover, and in the villages, rows of weather-beaten thatched huts, a white church rising above them, which had been used for other purposes, and today could easily house a field bakery. You can see local residents lined up in front of our bakery for bread, led by a smiling soldier. You can see the questioning glances of prisoners who, under the stern gaze of the escort, remove their caps. All of this can be seen, but only in a half-asleep state. At 2 a.m., I woke up the advance group. Half an hour later, the entire detachment. At 4:30, we set off. It is now 5:30 in the evening on July 26th. I am lying sweaty and covered in dust on the side of the road at the foot of a hill. From here, we have a long stretch of open road ahead of us. A rumble can be heard in the distance. After Suraz, air operations intensified. Entire squadrons of our dive bombers, escorted by fighters, carried out raids on the enemy. Yesterday, 3 Russian bombers circled over our lake after dropping their bomb load a few kilometers from here. Before they disappeared from view, we saw our fighters whiz past them, closing in on their tails, and machine guns rattled in the hot midday air. A few days ago, we came across more and more refugees. Then the roads became less crowded, and we passed camps for displaced persons, each holding between 1,000 and 1,200 prisoners. This is nothing less than the front line. In the villages, a huge number of houses have been abandoned. The remaining peasants fetch water for our horses. We take onions and small yellow turnips from their gardens and milk from cans. Most of them willingly share all of this. We continued along the road, keeping our distance. Far ahead, at the edge of the forest, mushroom-shaped plumes of smoke rise from shell explosions. We turned off before reaching that spot, onto a fairly passable, sandy road that seemed to go on forever. Night fell. In the north, the sky was still light. In the east and south, it was lit up by 2 burning villages. Above our heads, bombers were searching for targets and dropping bombs along the main road behind us. My riders were shaking and swaying in the saddles of their horses. At 3:30, we began to hurry. At 4, our wagon rushed to the command post. It is now 7 o'clock, and I am lying here, a little behind it, with 2 sections of the radio station set up and ready. The atmosphere is calm in the afternoon. We woke up and ate, went back to sleep, and were then roused by an alarm. The alarm turned out to be a false one, and we continued sleeping. Down below, across the meadow, captured Russians were being escorted to the rear. In the evening light, everything seems so friendly. It turned out to be a beautiful day. Finally, we had a little time for our own personal affairs. The war is proceeding with lulls. No decisive action. An anti-tank gun or a tank opens fire. We respond with our mortars. The gun emits unpleasant sighing sounds. Then, after a few shots, silence. Our batteries are shelling the enemy observation post with intense fire, and the Russians treat us to a few shells. We chew our bread and duck when the music starts playing. We can tell in advance where it's coming from. Up on the hill, the adjutant reports. "The tanks are attacking in 3 columns along the front, Herr Hauptmann." "Tell the artillerymen," the captain replies, and calmly finishes shaving. About 3/4 of an hour later, the tanks are advancing on us en masse. They are so close that they are getting behind our hill. The situation is becoming quite tense. 2 observation posts pack up and leave. The detachment command post and the battalion headquarters remain. Meanwhile, our infantry has advanced again toward the burning village. I'm lying in a crater on the hill. In situations like this, you always feel a sense of satisfaction from seeing what separates the wheat from the chaff. Most people are afraid. Only a few remain cheerful, and those are the ones you can rely on. That's all for today. If you liked the video, please support it with a like and subscribe to the channel. Bye for now, everyone, until we meet again.